All right, dictators.
I am Adolf Hitler!
Adolf Hitler was an Austrian-born politician who became the dictator of Nazi Germany and one of history's most infamous figures. Now, he was born in Austria and experienced a troubled childhood marked by strict parenting and academic struggles. And as a young man, he aspired to be an artist, but he would be rejected twice from the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. His early years were shaped by poverty and anti-Semitic ideologies that were prevalent in Vienna, and a deep sense of resentment towards the multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire. During World War I, he served as a soldier in the German army, where he found purpose and developed intense nationalism. Following Germany's defeat, Hitler joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party, in 1919, rising quickly through the ranks due to his fiery oratory and propaganda skills. His rise to power was fueled by Germany's post-World War I economic turmoil, also resentment over the Treaty of Versailles, and widespread political instability. In 1933, he would be appointed as chancellor, and shortly thereafter, he consolidated his power by dismantling democratic institutions and declaring himself Führer. Now, his regime would be characterized by totalitarian control, censorship, and the brutal suppression of dissent. He pursued aggressive expansionist policies, leading to the annexation of Austria and the invasion of Poland in 1939, which triggered World War II. Domestically, Hitler orchestrated the Holocaust, which was the systemic genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of others that were deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology, and his leadership plunged the world into a catastrophic war that resulted in over 70 million deaths. Now, despite initial military victories, his strategic miscalculations and the combined strength of the Allied forces would lead to Germany's defeat in 1945, and he would eventually commit suicide that same year. His dictatorship left a legacy of immense human suffering and perhaps a legacy of ideologies that people continue to carry to this day. And next up, we're talking about Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin was a Georgian-born revolutionary and political leader who became the dictator of the Soviet Union, shaping its trajectory from the 1920s until his death. Born in Georgia, he emerged from a modest background marked by a turbulent childhood, and he joined the Bolshevik movement in the early 20th century, participating in revolutionary activities and rising through the ranks as a trusted ally of Vladimir Lenin. After Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin skillfully consolidated power, using his position as General Secretary of the Communist Party to outmaneuver rivals, and by the late 1920s, he established himself as the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union, launching a campaign to transform the nation into a centralized, industrialized superpower. Stalin's rule was characterized by authoritarian control, sweeping economic reforms, and widespread political repression. His 5-year plans, initiated in the late 1920s, aimed to industrialize the Soviet Union rapidly, prioritizing heavy industry and collectivizing agriculture. And while these efforts modernized the economy, they also led to devastating famines, most notably the Holodomor in Ukraine, which caused millions of deaths. Stalin would maintain his grip on power through purges, show trials, and the infamous Great Terror of the 1930s, where millions were executed, imprisoned, or sent to labor camps, also known as gulags. During World War II, he would play a crucial role in the Allied victory, leading the Soviet Union in a brutal conflict against Nazi Germany that cost the lives of over 20 million Soviet citizens. In post-war, he would expand Soviet influence across Eastern Europe, ushering it into the Cold War. And in his later years, he was in very poor health, and he even mistrusted his doctors, as in September of 1952, several Kremlin doctors were arrested for allegedly plotting to kill senior politicians in what came to be known as the Doctors' Plot, and the majority of the accused were Jewish. Stalin ordered that the doctors be tortured to ensure their confessions, and 11 out of 13 of them were accused of being part of a Zionist American conspiracy to subvert the Soviet Union, and he would eventually pass away in 1953. All right, next up, we're going to talk about Fidel Castro. And Fidel Castro was a Cuban revolutionary politician and one of the most polarizing figures of the 20th century. He was born into a wealthy landowning family in Cuba, and he studied law at the University of Havana, where he became involved in student activism and leftist politics. His early political career was defined by his opposition to corruption and imperialist influences, particularly from the United States. After an unsuccessful assault on the Moncada barracks in 1953, Castro would be imprisoned, but later released under a political amnesty. He would be exiled to Mexico, and he formed the 26th of July movement with other revolutionaries, including Che Guevara. And in 1956, Castro and a small band of guerrillas launched an armed campaign against the US-backed dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. And over the next 3 years, they gained popular support, and in January 1959, Castro's forces overthrew Batista, marking the beginning of a socialist revolution in Cuba. Castro quickly consolidated power, transforming the island into a one-party communist state, and he nationalized industries, redistributed land, and implemented sweeping social reforms in education and healthcare, earning admiration from some as the champion of anti-imperialism and social justice. However, his rule was marked by authoritarianism, censorship, political repression, and a lack of democratic freedoms. His alignment with the Soviet Union during the Cold War would also bring global attention, particularly during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war, and also the Bay of Pigs incident. And Castro would continue to rule Cuba until 2008, when he handed power to his brother, Raul Castro, and he would eventually pass away in 2016. His legacy remains deeply divisive, symbolizing liberation and resistance for some, while epitomizing tyranny and oppression for others. All right, next over we talk about Benito Mussolini, and he was an Italian politician, journalist, and founder of fascism who served as Italy's dictator from 1925 to 1943. Now, born in Italy into a socialist family, he initially worked as a teacher and a journalist, and in his early years, he was a vocal socialist, editing leftist newspapers and advocating for anti-imperialist ideals. However, his stance shifted dramatically during World War I when he became a staunch nationalist and called for Italy's involvement in the war. This ideological transformation led to his expulsion from the Socialist Party, and after the war, he capitalized on widespread social unrest, economic hardship, and the fear of communism by forming the National Fascist Party in 1919. Mussolini gained support from various segments of society, including industrialists, veterans, and the middle class, and he rose to power in 1922 following the, quote, March on Rome that pressured King Victor Emmanuel III to appoint him as prime minister. By 1925, he dismantled democratic institutions and declared himself the Duce and established a totalitarian regime. Under his rule, he sought to recreate the grandeur of the Roman Empire through aggressive expansionist policies and propaganda that glorified his leadership, and he implemented policies to suppress dissent, control the press, and promote fascist ideology. His alliance with Nazi Germany during World War II led Italy into disastrous military campaigns that eroded his support, and by 1943, he was deposed and arrested, but later rescued by German forces. In 1945, as the Axis powers crumbled and World War II ended, Mussolini was captured and executed by Italian partisans. All right, next up we're going to talk about Kim Il-sung, and he was the founding leader of North Korea, officially known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK, and ruled the country from its establishment in 1948 until 1994. Now, he was born in Japanese-occupied Korea and was influenced by the anti-colonial resistance against Japan. He joined the communist movement in his youth and later fled to Manchuria, where he became involved in guerrilla warfare against Japanese forces. During World War II, he gained prominence as a resistance fighter aligned with the Soviet Union, which recognized his leadership potential. And after Japan's defeat in 1945, Korea was divided into Soviet-occupied and US-occupied zones, with Kim emerging as the Soviet-backed leader of the Northern Zone. In 1948, he became the first premier of the newly established DPRK. He consolidated power by purging political rivals and instituting a cult of personality that portrayed him as the eternal leader of the Korean people, and he launched the Korean War in 1950 by invading South Korea, seeking to unify the peninsula under communist rule. The war eventually ended in stalemate in 1953, leaving Korea divided along the 30th parallel, and domestically, Kim implemented strict one-party rule, centralizing authority and suppressing dissent. His policies emphasized self-reliance, or juche, collectivization, and heavy industrialization, but these often led to economic stagnation and widespread poverty. His regime became infamous for its human rights abuses, militarization, and isolationism, and upon his death in 1994, he left behind a tightly controlled authoritarian state ruled by his family, with his son Kim Jong-il succeeding him. And next up, we're going to be talking about Kim Jong-il, and he was the second leader of North Korea, ruling from 1994 until his death. Now, he was the son of Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, and Kim Jong-il was born during World War II, and reportedly was born in a Soviet military camp, although North Korean propaganda claims that he was born on Mount Paktu, a sacred site in Korean folklore. He was raised in a climate of rigid ideological indoctrination, and he was groomed from an early age to succeed his father. He attended Kim Il-sung University, where he studied Marxist-Leninist principles and later rose through the ranks of the ruling Workers' Party of Korea, or WPK. In the 1970s, he was heavily involved in the country's propaganda and cultural sectors, where he crafted the cult of personality around his father and began building his own. He officially succeeded his father in 1994, becoming the supreme leader of North Korea in a dynastic transfer of power. And his rule was characterized by an iron grip on the nation, further intensifying the regime's isolationism and authoritarianism. And under his leadership, North Korea faced a devastating famine in the 1990s, resulting in the deaths of millions due to poor economic management and international sanctions. And despite this, Kim prioritized the development of the country's military and nuclear weapons program, declaring a military-first policy. His reign was marked by severe human rights abuses, including political prison camps, censorship and suppression of dissent, and internationally he maintained a precarious position, alternating between aggressive posturing and limiting engagement with global powers. His death in 2011 led to the succession of his son, Kim Jong-un, solidifying the Kim family dynasty's grip on North Korea. And next up, we're already talking about Kim Jong-un, and he is the current supreme leader of North Korea and the third ruler of the Kim dynasty, which has maintained an authoritarian grip on the country since its founding. Now the son of Kim Jong-il and the grandson of Kim Il-sung, he was groomed from a very young age to continue his family's rule, and he was educated in Switzerland under a pseudonym, as he was exposed to Western culture but remained deeply tied to North Korean political doctrine. Following his father's death in 2011, he assumed power at a very young age, raising questions about his ability to consolidate control. However, through calculated purges of potential rivals, including the execution of his uncle and the alleged assassination of his half-brother, he secured his authority within the ruling Workers' Party of Korea and the military. As North Korea's leader, he has perpetuated the regime's repressive policies, including strict control over the media, pervasive surveillance, and brutal crackdowns on dissent. He prioritized the development of nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles, elevating North Korea's international profile and heightening tensions with the United States and its allies. Despite engaging in historic summits with world leaders, including U.S. President Donald Trump, these diplomatic efforts yielded little in terms of denuclearization or substantial policy change. And domestically, his focus on military strength and ideological loyalty has come at the expense of economic development, leaving North Korea impoverished and isolated. All right, next up, we're talking about Mao Zedong. And Mao Zedong was a Chinese revolutionary leader and founding figure of the People's Republic of China, where he ruled as the chairman of the Communist Party from its establishment in 1949 until his death. Now, he was born to a peasant family in the Hunan province, and his early life was marked by an interest in politics and revolutionary ideas inspired by Marxism-Leninism. He was a founding member of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 and played a key role in organizing the peasant class, believing their mobilization was essential for revolution. Following the failure of alliances with the nationalists Kuomintang or KMT, Mao led the CCP in a protracted struggle, including the famous Long March in 1934 to 1935, which solidified his leadership within the party. After years of civil war and resistance against Japanese occupation, Mao's forces defeated the KMT in 1949, leading to the establishment of a communist government in China. As China's leader, Mao implemented sweeping and radical policies aimed at transforming Chinese society, economy, and culture. His agrarian reforms redistributed land to peasants, but his later campaigns, such as the Great Leap Forward in 1958, sought rapid industrialization and collectivization, leading to catastrophic famine and the deaths of tens of millions. His Cultural Revolution in 1966 further consolidated his control, but unleashed chaos as millions were persecuted, cultural heritage was destroyed, and intellectuals were silenced under the guise of eradicating, quote, bourgeoisie influences. And in his final years, his health would decline, leading to his death in 1976 at the age of 82. All right, next up, we're talking about Muammar Gaddafi, and he was a Libyan revolutionary political leader and controversial figure who ruled Libya for over 4 decades. He was born in a Bedouin family near Libya, and he grew up in humble circumstances, receiving a traditional Islamic education before joining the military. He was influenced by Arab nationalism, and he harbored anti-colonial and anti-imperial sentiments. In 1969, as a young army officer, he led a bloodless coup against King Idris I, overthrowing the monarchy and establishing the Libyan Arab Republic. He quickly positioned himself as the, quote, brother leader and self-styled revolutionary, promoting his vision of an Islamic socialist state. And once in power, he implemented sweeping changes, including nationalizing the oil industry, redistributing wealth, and introducing his, quote, Third International national theory outlined in his Green Book. His regime combined elements of socialism, Arab nationalism, and authoritarianism, which centralized control and pervasive surveillance. And his foreign policy was marked by support for anti-imperialist and often militant movements worldwide, which led to accusations of state-sponsored terrorism. Domestically, his rule was characterized by suppression of dissent, political repression, and human rights abuses. Despite Libya's oil wealth to fund infrastructure, education, and healthcare, his eccentric leadership style, corruption, and mismanagement left many disillusioned. And in 2011, amid the wave of Arab Spring uprisings, Libyans rebelled against his regime, leading to a NATO-backed intervention. Gaddafi would be captured and killed by rebel forces in October 2011, ending his 42-year rule. His legacy remains polarizing, viewed by some as a champion of Pan-Africanism and anti-imperialism, but by others as a brutal dictator whose policies and actions destabilized Libya and alienated much of the international community. All right, next up we're going to talk about Pol Pot. And Pol Pot was a Cambodian revolutionary and dictator who led the Khmer Rouge regime from 1975 to 1979. He was raised in a relatively affluent royal family where he received a French education in Phnom Penh and later in Paris, where he became involved with communist ideologies. After returning to Cambodia in the 1950s, he joined the underground communist movement, eventually becoming the leader of the Khmer Rouge in the 1960s. He was influenced by Maoist thought and radical Marxist-Leninist ideals and envisioned a complete societal transformation to create a self-sufficient agrarian utopia. His movement gained traction during the Cambodian Civil War in 1967, capitalizing on widespread discontent with the corrupt US-backed Lon Nol regime and the devastation caused by the American bombing campaigns, and his rise to power will culminate in April 1975 when the Khmer Rouge captured Phnom Penh and established democratic Kampuchea. And once in control, he initiated one of the most radical and brutal social experiments in history, forcibly evacuating cities, abolishing money, schools, religion, and private property, and compelling the population to work in collective farms. His regime targeted intellectuals, ethnic minorities, and perceived enemies of the state, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 1.7 to 2 million people, about a quarter of Cambodia's population, through execution, starvation, and forced labor. His dictatorship would eventually end in 1979 when Vietnamese forces invaded Cambodia, toppling the Khmer Rouge, and he would flee to the jungle, leading a guerrilla resistance until his death in 1998. All right, next up we're talking about Chiang Kai-shek, and he was a Chinese military and political leader who played a central role in the 20th century Chinese history, leading the Republic of China and shaping the nationalist government. Now, he was born in Zhejiang province to a modest family and pursued a military education in Japan, where he became exposed to nationalist ideas. He joined the Kuomintang, or KMT, under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen, and quickly rose through its ranks, becoming a key figure in the party's efforts to unify China after years of warlordism and fragmentation. Now, following Sun Yat-sen's death in 1925, Chiang emerged as the KMT's leader, solidifying his authority through the Northern Expedition in 1926, which defeated regional warlords and nominally unified China under the nationalist government based in Nanjing. However, his rule was marked by ongoing challenges, including internal factionalism, the rise of the Communist Party, and Japanese aggression. His role as dictator became evident as he centralized power, suppressed political opposition, and used authoritarian methods to maintain control. And while he promoted modernization, infrastructure development, and military expansion, his government was plagued by corruption and inefficiency. The Chinese Civil War between the nationalists and communists became a defining struggle in his leadership, and despite initial success, his forces were ultimately defeated by Mao Zedong's Communist Party after World War II. In 1949, Chiang and his government retreated to Taiwan, where he continued to lead the Republic of China under martial law, transforming the island into an authoritarian state. And while he is credited for Taiwan's eventual economic growth and development, his rule was also marked by political repression and suppression of dissent, often referred to as the White Terror. And he would remain the Director General of the KMT until his death in 1975, and he would be succeeded by his son, who became president in 1978. All right, next up we're going to be talking about Deng Xiaoping, and he was a Chinese revolutionary and statesman who played a pivotal role in shaping modern China. He was born in Sichuan province and joined the communist movement in his youth, studying in France and later in the Soviet Union. He became an active member of the Chinese Communist Party and participated in the Long March, which was a defining event in the party's history, and he rose to the ranks of the CCP under Mao Zedong, serving in various political and military roles. However, his pragmatic and reformist stance often clashed with Mao's radical policies, and during the Cultural Revolution in 1966, he was purged from leadership and sent into internal exile. Following Mao's death in 1976, he returned to power, emerging as China's paramount leader by 1978, despite holding no formal office as head of state or government. As China's de facto leader, he spearheaded transformative economic reforms that shifted the country from a centrally planned economy to one that embraced market-oriented policies, coining the phrase socialism with Chinese characteristics. His reforms included the introduction of the household responsibility system in agriculture, the establishment of the special economic zones or SEZs, and the opening of China to foreign investment and trade. These changes catalyzed rapid economic growth and lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, transforming China into a global economic power. However, Deng's tenure also revealed his authoritarian approach to governance. He maintained strict control over political dissent, most infamously ordering the military crackdown on pro-democracy demonstrators in Tiananmen Square in 1989. This event underscored his willingness to suppress opposition to ensure political stability and the CCP's dominance. During the course of his leadership, he was actually named Time Person of the Year in 1978 and in 1985. And despite his contributions to China's modernization, his legacy has, of course, been marked by controversy. He was the one that also introduced the one-child policy, and he would eventually die on February 19th, 1997 from lung infection and Parkinson's disease. All right, next we're going to talk about Hideki Tojo, and he was a Japanese military officer and politician who became the Prime Minister of Japan during much of World War II. He was born in the samurai class in Tokyo, and he entered the Imperial Japanese Army at the age of 19, rising through the ranks due to his dedication, discipline, and military prowess. He studied at the prestigious Army Staff College, and after World War I, he held various military positions, which deepened his commitment to the military's dominant role in Japanese politics. Through the 1930s, Japan's military became increasingly influential, and he aligned himself with nationalist and expansionist factions within the army. And by the time Japan began its aggressive campaigns in China, Tojo had become one of its most senior military officers, known for his staunch support of the imperial system and his belief in Japan's divine destiny to dominate East Asia. His rise to power peaked in 1941 when he became Japan's prime minister under Emperor Hirohito, and as prime minister, he was a key architect of Japan's expansionist policies, overseeing the decision to attack Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, which led to Japan's entry into World War II. He also played a critical role in strengthening Japan's military alliances with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, hoping to secure dominance over the Pacific region. Under his leadership, they launched brutal military campaigns across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, often accompanied by war crimes, including the use of forced labor and atrocities against civilians. However, as Japan faced increasing defeats in the later years of the war, he would be forced to resign in 1944, and after Japan's surrender in 1945, he would be arrested, tried for war crimes, and executed in 1948. All right, next we're going to talk about Ho Chi Minh, and he was a Vietnamese revolutionary leader, statesman, and the founding father of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which later became the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. He was born in central Vietnam and rose to prominence in the fight against colonialism. He was heavily influenced by Marxism-Leninism during his time abroad, particularly in France, the Soviet Union, and China. And in the 1920s, he became founding member of the Communist Party of Vietnam and dedicated himself to the cause of Vietnamese independence from French colonial rule. He was instrumental in organizing and leading the Viet Minh, a communist-led resistance movement that fought against the French in the First Indochina War in 1946. And following the French defeat in 1954, Vietnam was divided into the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the anti-communist South. His leadership would be defined by his determination to unify Vietnam under communist rule, though his governance in the North was increasingly characterized by authoritarianism. And as president and later the de facto leader of North Vietnam, he focused on land reforms, the collectivization of agriculture, and the suppression of political rivals, often with harsh methods. Despite his role as liberator in the eyes of many Vietnamese, his policies also mirrored those of other communist dictatorships in terms of repression and the centralization of power. In the 1960s, he presided over the Vietnam War, supporting the insurgency in South Vietnam with the goal of reunifying the country under communist control. And his death in 1969 occurred before he could see the ultimate success of his struggle, as South Vietnam fell to the communist forces in 1975, completing the unification of Vietnam. All right, next we're talking about Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was a French military leader and emperor who rose to prominence during the tumultuous period of the French Revolution and became one of history's most influential figures. He was born on the island of Corsica to a modest family and attended military school in mainland France, where he developed a passion for the military and a strong sense of ambition. His early military career began with his involvement in the French Revolution, where he gained recognition for his leadership and tactical brilliance, especially in the Italian campaigns in the defense of the French Republic against external threats. His reputation as a brilliant strategist was solidified in 1799 when he played a pivotal role in the coup that overthrew the French Directory, which was the government at the time, and established the consulate with Napoleon as the first consul. His rise to power culminated in 1804 when he declared himself Emperor of the French, and as emperor, he implemented sweeping reforms, including the Napoleonic Code, which streamlined French law and became a model for many legal systems worldwide. He also expanded French territory through military conquest, defeating European coalitions and establishing a vast empire that stretched from Spain to Russia at its height. However, his imperial ambitions and aggressive foreign policies eventually led to his downfall. His disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 weakened his forces, and after a series of defeats, he was exiled to the island of Elba in 1814. He would actually briefly return to power in 1815 for the 100 Days, but was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. All right, next we talk about Saddam Hussein, and he was an Iraqi political leader who became one of the most notorious and influential dictators in the Middle East. He was born in a poor family in Iraq and rose to prominence in the 1950s as a member of the Ba'ath Party, a pan-Arab nationalist and socialist political movement. In 1968, he played a pivotal role in a coup that brought the Ba'ath Party to power in Iraq, and by 1979, he consolidated enough influence within the party and the military to become the country's president. His rise was marked by his ruthless political maneuvering, including purges of rivals and the establishment of a cult of personality, and his leadership was defined by harsh repression, with his government using violence, intimidation, and mass executions to silence opposition and maintain control over the country. As president, he ruled Iraq with an iron fist, implementing policies that transformed Iraq into a totalitarian state, and he centralized power in the hands of his family and loyalists, and his regime was notorious for human rights abuses, including the use of chemical weapons against Kurdish civilians during the Anfal campaign in the 1980s. His role as a dictator expanded as he sought to position himself as the leader of the Arab world, frequently challenging Western powers in neighboring countries. His invasion of Iran in 1980 led to a brutal and costly 8-year war, followed by the 1990 invasion of Kuwait, which ultimately triggered the Gulf War and resulted in devastating consequences for Iraq. After the Gulf War, Iraq faced international sanctions and increasing internal unrest. Despite this, Hussein managed to maintain his grip on power until the US-led invasion in 2003 ousted him from power. He would be captured, tried for crimes against humanity, and executed in 2006. All right, next we're talking about Vladimir Lenin, and he was a Russian revolutionary, political theorist, and leader of the Bolshevik Party, which played a pivotal role in the Russian Revolution of 1917. He was born into an upper middle-class family and was deeply influenced by the execution of his older brother, who was involved in a failed assassination attempt on Tsar Alexander III. This event shaped his revolutionary ideals and commitment to overthrowing the autocratic system in Russia. He studied law at the University of Kazan, but was expelled for his radical activities and spent several years in exile, during which he became increasingly involved in Marxist theory and revolutionary politics. His return to Russia in 1917, following the February Revolution that overthrew Tsar Nicholas II, was facilitated by the German government, which hoped to destabilize Russia and hasten its exit from World War I. And upon his return, he led the Bolshevik faction in seizing power in the October Revolution, promising peace, land, and bread to the population and workers. His rise to power was marked by his ability to galvanize support among the working class and soldiers, leading to the overthrow of the provisional government and establishment of the Soviet government. Once in power, he quickly set about dismantling the old social, political, and economic structures of the Russian Empire, and he pulled Russia out of World War I by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. He redistributed land and nationalized key industries. And while he initially advocated for the establishment of a socialist state based on workers' councils, his role became increasingly authoritarian, particularly after the Civil War in 1917 between the Bolshevik Reds and the anti-Bolshevik Whites. He implemented war communism, a series of policies that centralized control and suppressed opposition, including the use of the Cheka, a secret police force. Despite being a revolutionary leader, his regime exhibited dictatorial tendencies, and by the time of his death in 1924, he had transformed the Soviet Union into a one-party state, with the Communist Party firmly in control. Our next one, we talk about Bashar Al-Assad, and he was born in 1965 in Damascus, Syria, and is a Syrian politician who was the president of Syria from 2000 up until recently, 2024. He was the second son of Hafez al-Assad, the longtime president of Syria, and was not initially groomed for political leadership. After studying medicine in Syria and completing a residency in London, his life took a sharp turn following the sudden death of his older brother, Bassel, who had been the heir. With little political experience, Bashar was brought back to Syria and quickly positioned by his father to assume leadership. Upon Hafez al-Assad's death in 2000, Bashar was thrust into power at the age of 34. And his early years in office were marked by promises of political reform and modernization, yet these reforms largely remained superficial as he quickly consolidated autocratic control, continuing his father's policies of repression. As Syria's ruler, he maintained a tight grip on power, suppressing opposition, curbing civil liberties, and using brutal force against dissent. His government tactics came into stark relief during the Syrian Civil War, which began in 2011 as a part of the Arab Spring protests. Initially, Assad's regime attempted to suppress the protests with violent crackdowns, which escalated into full-blown civil war involving multiple factions, including rebel groups, Islamic extremists, and international powers. The war led to massive loss of life, displacement of millions, and widespread destruction of Syria's infrastructure. His regime received crucial support from Russia and Iran, which helped them regain control over large parts of the country. And while Assad did not officially declare himself emperor, his reign increasingly took on imperial characteristics as he consolidated power. And his rule is often characterized as a brutal dictatorship, notorious for its use of chemical weapons, torture, and mass killings of civilians. He managed to survive in power up until the fall of his regime in 2024, when a coalition of Syrian rebels mounted several offenses with the intention of ousting Assad. And on the morning of December 8th, 2024, as rebel troops entered Damascus, Assad fled to Moscow and was granted political asylum by the Russian government. And later that day, his regime would collapse. All right, next we're going to talk about Aleksandr Lukashenko, and he was born in 1954 in the Soviet Union and is the first and current president of Belarus, having been in power since 1994. He was raised in a rural village and pursued a career in agriculture and later joined the Communist Party, eventually working his way up the ranks of Soviet and post-Soviet government structures. His early political career was marked by his role as a collective farm director, where he built a reputation for his hardline approach to management and emphasis on discipline. And after Belarus gained its independence following the collapse of the Soviet Union, he emerged as a populist leader who promised stability, economic recovery, and a return to Soviet-style governance. In 1994, he won the presidency in a relatively democratic election, but soon after, he consolidated power through constitutional changes, authoritarian tactics, and curbing political freedoms and silencing opposition. Over the next decades, he maintained tight control over Belarus, using state-controlled media to bolster his image, and his governance style became increasingly autocratic, characterized by the suppression of opposition parties and the dismantling of democratic institutions. He maintained Belarus's close ties with Russia while asserting a fiercely independent stance when it came to foreign policy, which often put him at odds with the West. And his domestic policies have relied heavily on state-owned enterprises and a mix of Soviet-era economic practices. As of the 2020 presidential elections, which were widely seen as rigged, his rule entered a new phase with significant international condemnation of his increasing authoritarianism and allegations of electoral fraud, drawing criticism from both domestic opposition and the international community. However, he remains in power to this day. All right, next up we're going to talk about Ante Pavelić, and he was a Croatian fascist leader and the founder of the Ustaše movement, a far-right, ultra-nationalist organization that sought to create an independent Croatian state through violent means. He was born in the Kingdom of Croatia, Slavonia, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he was an ardent nationalist and anti-Yugoslav from a young age. In his early years, he became involved in political activism, which led him to join the Ustaše, a radical group that opposed the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. After being imprisoned for attempting to assassinate King Alexander I of Yugoslavia in 1934, he fled to Italy, where he received support from Benito Mussolini and developed his ideology of Croatian fascism. During the late 1930s and early 1940s, his movement gained momentum, attracting attention for its violent campaigns aimed at establishing an ethnically pure Croatian state. His rise to power came with the Axis powers invasion of Yugoslavia in 1941, during which the Nazis and Italians dismantled the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and following the collapse of the Yugoslav monarchy, Pavelić was installed as the puppet leader of the newly created independent state of Croatia, a fascist client state under Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And he would go on to implement policies of extreme nationalism, promoting the idea of a racially pure Croatian state through the forced assimilation, persecution, and mass murder of ethnic Serbs, Jews, Romani people, and anti-fascists. He held dictatorial powers over the state of Croatia until its collapse in 1945, as the Axis powers were defeated in Europe. And following the end of World War II, he fled to Argentina, where he lived in exile until his death in 1959. All right, next up we're going to talk about Augusto Pinochet, and he was a Chilean military officer and dictator who ruled Chile with an iron fist from 1973 until 1990. He was born in Chile and had a distinguished career in the Chilean army, rising through the ranks to become a general, and his rise to power was rooted in his opposition to the left-wing government of President Salvador Allende, whose socialist policies sparked unrest and economic challenges in the country. In September 1973, Pinochet led a brutal military coup that overthrew Allende, marking the beginning of his dictatorship, and he justified his actions by claiming the need to restore order and combat leftist influence in the country. Once in power, he implemented widespread authoritarian rule, suspending the constitution, dissolving the legislature, and silencing political opposition. His regime was notorious for its human rights abuses, including the widespread use of torture, forced disappearances, and executions. His regime also introduced neoliberal economic reforms, which included privatizing industries and rolling back social programs. While these policies did lead to economic growth, they disproportionately benefited the wealthy and exacerbated inequality. Pinochet was eventually forced out of power in 1990. However, he remained influential in Chilean politics as he retained control over the military and was granted immunity from prosecution for his crimes. Our next story, we talk about Enver Pasha, and he was a prominent Ottoman military officer and revolutionary who played a key role in the late stages of the Ottoman Empire, leading the country through tumultuous periods during World War I and its eventual disintegration. He was born into a poor family in the Ottoman province of Albania, and Enver pursued a military career, enrolling in the Imperial Military Academy in Istanbul. His early involvement in the Young Turks movement, a political faction that sought to modernize and reform the Ottoman Empire, led him to rise to the ranks of the Ottoman Empire, and he became a hero in the revolution in 1908 when the Young Turks successfully deposed Sultan Abdulhamid II, restoring the constitution and ensuring a period of relative political freedom. Enver quickly aligned himself with the movement's Committee of Union and Progress, becoming one of the most influential leaders, and by 1913 he had risen to the position of Minister of War, effectively becoming the de facto leader of the Ottoman Empire. His militaristic policies and vision for a pan-Turkic empire, alongside his ambition for territorial expansion, culminated in the Ottoman Empire's entry into World War I on the side of the Central Powers. His leadership during the war was marked by a series of military failures, including the disastrous Gallipoli campaign, which significantly undermined his standing. In 1918, following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the defeat of the Central Powers, Enver fled into exile, initially to Germany, although he briefly sought to revive his fortunes by attempting to create a pan-Turkic state in Central Asia. However, his ambitions ultimately led to his downfall. In 1922, he was killed in a battle in Tajikistan while attempting to lead an army against Soviet forces, ending his once powerful influence. All right, next up we're going to talk about Ferdinand Marcos, and he was a Filipino politician, military officer, and the 10th president of the Philippines. He rose to prominence as a young man due to his academic achievements and his military service during World War II, and he claimed to have been a war hero, although his stories about his exploits have been widely disputed. He initially entered politics in 1949 as a member of the House of Representatives, later serving as a senator from 1959 to 1965, and his rise to national prominence culminated in his presidential campaign, which he won in 1965. During his first term, he implemented infrastructure projects that earned him favor with the public, but his real consolidation of power came during his second term. In 1969, he was re-elected president, and in 1972, citing the threat of communist insurgency and civil unrest, Marcos declared martial law, which gave him sweeping powers to rule by decree, dissolve the legislature, and suppress political opposition. His government became increasingly autocratic, with widespread human rights abuses, censorship, and the imprisonment of political rivals. He also engaged in massive corruption, amassing billions of dollars in wealth, much of which was hidden in foreign bank accounts. In the 1980s, opposition to his rule grew and public unrest intensified. And in 1986, following a disputed election and the People Power Revolution, Marcos would eventually be forced into exile in Hawaii, where he died in 1989. All right, next over we talk about Josip Tito, and he was a Yugoslav revolutionary and statesman who played a central role in the formation and leadership of socialist Yugoslavia. Born in what is now Croatia, his early life was marked by his service in the Austro-Hungarian army during World War I, where he was captured and spent several years in a prisoner of war camp. After the war, he joined the Communist Party and became involved in organizing labor strikes and resistance movements. His rise to prominence came during World War II, when he became the leader of the Yugoslav Partisans, a communist-led resistance group that fought against Axis powers and the puppet regime of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. His leadership in the fight, both against fascist occupiers and internal enemies, including the royalist Chetniks, earned them significant support from the population, and by 1945, he had secured control over Yugoslavia, which became a socialist federation. Tito became the prime minister and later the president of Yugoslavia, and his leadership was characterized by a distinctive form of socialism known as Titoism. Unlike other Eastern European communist leaders, Tito pursued an independent foreign policy, resisting Soviet influence and refusing to align with Joseph Stalin, which led to a break between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union in 1948. His leadership established a one-party state, but he created a system of federalism that allowed for greater autonomy among Yugoslavia's diverse ethnic groups, which helped stave off ethnic tensions for several decades. Tito maintained his grip on power through a combination of authoritarian control, military strength, and charisma, and was a prominent figure in the non-aligned movement, seeking to maintain Yugoslavia's independence in the Cold War. His long reign and absolute control over Yugoslavia, as well as his ability to maintain both domestic stability and international influence, earned him a status of immense authority, almost akin to that of a monarch. He would become ill over the course of 1979 and would eventually die on May 4th, 1980, and many world leaders would attend his funeral. Our next up, we're going to talk about Juan Perón, and he was an Argentine military officer and politician who served as the president of Argentina for 3 terms and became one of the most influential figures in the country's history. Born in the province of Buenos Aires, Perón began his career in the Argentine military, where he quickly rose through the ranks. His early political influence came from his involvement in labor reforms and his work in the Department of Labor, which helped him build a strong base of support among working-class Argentinians. In 1943, following a military coup, Perón became the Secretary of Labor and Social Welfare in the new government, and he gained popularity by implementing labor rights and reforms and fostering a sense of national unity through policies that aimed to improve the lives of workers and the poor. This popularity, combined with the backing of labor unions, allowed him to rise to presidency in 1946 after a successful electoral campaign. His presidency was characterized by authoritarianism, nationalism, and the establishment of a personality cult. His government focused on state intervention in the economy, nationalizing key industries, and implementing social welfare programs to benefit the working class. However, his rule was also marked by repression of political opposition, censorship, and a tight grip on the media. In 1955, after growing opposition and economic difficulties, Perón was overthrown by a military coup and went into exile. Despite his absence from Argentina, he remained an important political figure, with his followers continuing to champion his policies, and he would return to Argentina in 1973 and was elected president again. However, his health was deteriorating, and his government became increasingly unstable. He would die in 1974, leaving behind a complex legacy as a leader who transformed Argentina's social and political landscape through his populist policies and authoritarian rule. All right, next up we're going to talk about Leonid Brezhnev, and he was a Soviet politician and leader of the Soviet Union from 1964 until his death in 1982. Born in Ukraine to a working-class family, he joined the Communist Party in the 1920s and rose through its ranks after World War II. Initially serving in various military and administrative roles, he became a trusted figure in the party's leadership during the post-war period. His political career accelerated when he became the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1964, and he was initially seen as a stabilizing figure in Soviet politics, promising a return to stability and the consolidation of power within the party. He won support from key figures within the party and military, particularly regarding his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis and agricultural reforms. As leader of the Soviet Union, he solidified his power through patronage networks and by maintaining a tight grip on the country's military and security apparatus. And under his leadership, the USSR experienced a period of stagnation, often referred to as the Brezhnev era, marked by economic decline, political repression, and a focus on military expansion. His policies emphasized a continuation of Soviet control over Eastern Europe and the maintenance of a strong military presence globally, exemplified by the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in 1979. Despite his initially moderate image, he became an increasingly autocratic leader, maintaining power through a cult of personality and suppressing any form of political opposition. And his leadership eventually left the USSR in a state of political stagnation, contributing to its later collapse in the 1990s. His health would deteriorate in the late 1970s, but he remained in power until his death in 1982. All right, next up, we're going to talk about Leopoldo Galtieri, and he was an Argentine military officer and politician who rose to prominence as a key figure in Argentina's military dictatorship during the late 20th century. Born in the city of Buenos Aires, he was educated at the Argentine Military Academy, where he was trained as a career officer in the Argentine Army. He held several important military positions before becoming involved in the country's political turbulence during the 1970s, and during this time, Argentina was ruled by a brutal military junta that engaged in widespread human rights abuses during the Dirty War, or La Guerra Sucia, a period marked by systematic repression of perceived political enemies. His career progressed rapidly, and in 1981, he was appointed as the commander-in-chief of the Argentine Army. He would eventually also be appointed as Argentina's de facto president after the military junta ousted his predecessor, General Videla, and he assumed the presidency during a period of intense internal strife, with Argentina facing severe economic problems, inflation, and mounting public dissatisfaction. His rule would be marked by authoritarianism and the continuation of state-sponsored violence against political dissidents, and he made a bold decision to invade the Falkland Islands, which was a British overseas territory in the South Atlantic region, in April of 1982. However, this war ended in failure for Argentina as British forces defeated the Argentine military, leading to Galtieri's downfall, and in 1982, he would be forced to resign and his regime collapsed. All right, next up, we're going to talk about Nicolae Ceaușescu, and he was a Romanian communist politician who served as a general secretary of the Romanian Communist Party from 1965 until 1989. Born in a rural village, he joined the Communist Party in his youth and quickly rose through the ranks, eventually becoming one of the most powerful figures in post-World War II Romania. After the death of Romania's communist leader, Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej, in 1965, Ceaușescu assumed leadership of the country, and initially he was seen as a reformist figure who distanced Romania from the Soviet Union. However, as his power consolidated, he became increasingly authoritarian. He strengthened his control of the country by purging his political opponents and suppressing dissent, and by the 1970s and 1980s, he transformed from a communist leader into an autocrat, embracing a cult of personality and establishing a near-totalitarian regime. He implemented policies that led to economic hardship for the Romanian people, including measures aimed at paying off foreign debt, which caused widespread shortages of food, fuel, and basic goods, and his regime was marked by constant surveillance, censorship, and the oppression of ethnic minorities. However, his rule would end abruptly in December of 1989 when protests erupted in the city of Timisoara and spread across the country. Ceaușescu and his wife, Elena, would be arrested, tried, and executed in 1989, marking the end of Romania's communist regime. All right, next up, we're going to talk about Ngô Đình Diệm, and he was a Vietnamese politician and the first president of South Vietnam, serving from 1955 until 1963. He was born into a Catholic family in central Vietnam and was educated in French-controlled Vietnam and later in France, and he became involved in nationalist movements during the early years of Vietnamese independence struggles, but his strong Catholic identity and aristocratic background distanced him from the communist-led resistance movements. After the defeat of France in the First Indochina War and the subsequent division of Vietnam in 1954, Diem was selected by the United States to lead the newly established South Vietnam, largely due to his anti-communist stance. He was made the Prime Minister of South Vietnam in 1954, and in 1955, he declared himself president, solidifying his rule over the southern half of the country. His rise to power marked the beginning of a highly centralized authoritarian regime, and despite initially receiving U.S. support, his leadership became quickly characterized by repression, censorship, and favoritism toward the Catholic minority, which alienated the Buddhist majority and other ethnic groups in South Vietnam. His government suppressed political opposition, dissolved opposition parties, and used the military and secret police to maintain control. Diem also resisted reforms that could have eased tensions with his own people and the communist North, making his rule increasingly unpopular, and his leadership culminated in widespread unrest and protests, most notably by the Buddhist monks who set themselves on fire in public demonstrations against his regime. Ultimately, his autocratic rule and inability to unify the country led to his downfall. In 1963, Diem was overthrown and assassinated in a coup orchestrated by his own military leaders with the approval of the US government. And his death would mark a significant turning point in South Vietnam's political instability and its ongoing conflict with the communist North. All right, next up we're going to talk about Pervez Musharraf, and he was a Pakistani military officer and politician who served as the 10th president of Pakistan from 2001 to 2008. Born in Delhi during British colonial rule, he moved to Pakistan following the partition in 1947. He joined the Pakistan Military Academy in 1961 and quickly rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a 4-star general. In 1998, he was appointed as the Chief Army of Staff, and in 1999, he played a prominent role in the Kargil War between Pakistan and India. On October 12, 1999, Musharraf would seize power in a bloodless military coup, ousting Nawaz Sharif, who had attempted to dismiss him, and the coup came after a standoff over the military role in the Kargil conflict. And Musharraf soon assumed the role of Pakistan's chief executive, consolidating control of the country's military and political apparatus. He ruled Pakistan as a military dictator, navigating the volatile politics of a nuclear-armed nation. And initially, his government enjoyed substantial support both domestically and internationally, particularly after the September 11, 2001 attacks, as Musharraf aligned Pakistan with the United States in the war on terror, which brought economic aid and military support, but also domestic backlash, especially over his stance on Islamic extremism and military cooperation with the West. His rule, however, was marred by authoritarian policies, including the suspension of the constitution, dismissal of judges, and curbing of press freedoms. In 2007, Musharraf declared a state of emergency and dismissed the judiciary, which led to widespread protests. And despite his attempts to modernize Pakistan's economy and enhance its global standing, he faced growing opposition, particularly from the political parties of Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif. And in 2008, under mounting pressure, he resigned as president to avoid impeachment. And after fleeing to self-imposed exile, he returned to Pakistan in 2013 to make a political comeback. However, he would be convicted for treason. Our next we'll read about Syngman Rhee, and he was a Korean politician, independence activist, and the first president of South Korea, serving from 1948 until his resignation in 1960. He was educated in Korea and later in the United States, where he earned a degree from Princeton University, and his early life was marked by his strong opposition to Japanese colonial rule over Korea, and he became a prominent figure in the Korean independence movement. During his time in the US, he worked to garner international support for Korean independence and was instrumental in advocating for Korea's sovereignty at the Versailles Peace Conference after World War I. However, despite his efforts, Korea remained under Japanese control until the end of World War II, and following Japan's defeat, Korea was divided along the 30th parallel, the Soviet Union occupying the north and the United States occupying the south. Rhee, who was staunchly anti-communist, became the leader of the pro-Western government in the South, and in 1948, with the support of the United States, he became the first president of the Republic of Korea. As president, he established a highly centralized authoritarian regime and suppressed political opposition, and used the Korean National Police and military to maintain control, positioning himself as the unchallenged leader of the nation. His leadership was characterized by anti-communist purges and a strong reliance on U.S. military and economic support, and while he was initially popular for his role in securing South Korea's independence and his stance against communism, his presidency became increasingly dictatorial as he manipulated elections and extended his rule through constitutional amendments, consolidating power. His government was marred by corruption, economic challenges, and political repression, and his rule would end in 1960 after student protests and widespread public dissatisfaction culminated in his resignation. He would spend his later years in exile and eventually died in Hawaii in 1965. Our next up, we read about Slobodan Milošević, and he was a Serbian politician who rose to power during the tumultuous period of Yugoslavia's dissolution in the 1990s. He studied economics and became involved in Communist Party politics, eventually rising through the ranks and becoming the head of the Communist Party in Serbia. In the 1980s, he capitalized on growing Serbian nationalism and discontent with the Yugoslav Federation, portraying himself as the defender of Serbian interests. He eventually became the president of Serbia in 1989 after manipulating political and social divisions particularly in Kosovo, where he stoked fears among ethnic Serbs of oppression by ethnic Albanians. And his rhetoric and control over state-run media helped him build a powerful base of support among Serbs. His authoritarian grip on power grew as he sought to expand Serbia's influence during the breakup of Yugoslavia, and by the early 1990s, he was a central figure in the brutal ethnic conflicts that erupted in Bosnia, Croatia, and later Kosovo. His regime was heavily involved in supporting Bosnian Serb and Croatian Serb forces, contributing to war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and genocide during the Yugoslav wars. Milosevic's policies of aggression and territorial expansion led to widespread international condemnation, and by 1999, NATO intervened in Kosovo, forcing him to withdraw Serbian forces. And despite losing Kosovo and facing growing domestic opposition, he remained president of Yugoslavia until 2000. And after losing power in a popular uprising, he was arrested and handed over to the International Criminal Tribunal, where he faced charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and he eventually died in custody in 2006 before a verdict was reached. All right, next up we're going to talk about Suharto, and he was an Indonesian military officer and political leader who became the country's second president, ruling from 1967 until 1998. Born in a small village on the island of Java, he came from a modest background and joined the Dutch East Indies Army during the Japanese occupation of Indonesia in World War II. After Indonesia declared its independence in 1945, he joined the Indonesian National Army and quickly rose to the ranks. He played a pivotal role in the military struggle against the Dutch during the Indonesian National Revolution, which ultimately led to Indonesia's independence in 1949, and as the country stabilized, he became increasingly involved in politics. And by the mid-1960s, Indonesia was struggling with political instability, economic decline, and a rise in communist influence. In 1965, after a failed coup by communist sympathizers led to a violent purge of leftist elements, General Suharto effectively took control of the military. He consolidated his power in the aftermath of the coup by sidelining President Sukarno, the nation's founding leader, and assuming leadership in 1967. By 1968, he officially became president using a combination of military control, political repression, and strategic alliances to establish a highly centralized and authoritarian regime. This New Order regime focused on economic modernization, which led to significant economic growth, but also fostered widespread corruption and human rights abuses, and he maintained a strong grip on power through a mix of coercion, manipulation of political institutions, and suppression of dissent. His control over Indonesia was often described as autocratic, as he ruled with a level of dominance that resembled that of a monarch, until his eventual downfall in 1998, which was triggered by economic crises, widespread protests, and political pressure. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about Idi Amin, and he was a Ugandan military officer and politician who served as the third president of Uganda from 1971 to 1979. Born in Koboko, Uganda, he joined the British colonial army, or the King's African Rifles, in 1946 as a cook, but quickly rose to the ranks due to his physical prowess and military skill. Following Uganda's independence in 1962, Amin became a prominent figure in the Ugandan army, eventually rising to commander of the armed forces. In 1971, he would seize power through a military coup, overthrowing President Milton Obote. He declared himself president and established a military dictatorship. During his 8-year rule, he implemented policies marked by ethnic persecution, political repression, and massive economic mismanagement. He expelled Uganda's Asian population, that being many Indian Ugandans, in 1972, which effectively crippled the nation's economy. His regime was infamous for its human rights abuses, including the extrajudicial killings of political opponents, ethnic groups, and dissenters, with estimates of his victims ranging between 100,000 and 500,000. His erratic behavior and international provocations, including his support for hijackers during the 1976 Entebbe incident, further isolated Uganda globally. In 1978, after attempting to annex parts of Tanzania, Amin faced a counter-invasion by Tanzanian forces and Ugandan exiles, leading to him being overthrown in 1979. Amin fled into exile, living in Libya, Iraq, and finally Saudi Arabia, where he remained until his death in 2003. All right, next up we're going to talk about Mobutu Sese Seko, and he was a Congolese military officer and politician who ruled Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as a dictator from 1965 to 1997. Mobutu began his career in the Belgian colonial army, where he demonstrated ambition and discipline. Now, after Congo's independence in 1960, he aligned himself with Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, but later turned against him, playing a key role in Lumumba's ousting and eventual assassination, all with backing from Western powers during the Cold War. Mobutu would seize power in 1965 through a coup, establishing a regime that promised stability after the chaos of the Congo crisis, and he would consolidate power by outlawing opposition, instituting a one-party system under the popular movement of the revolution, and enforcing policies aimed at promoting, quote, authentic African culture, such as renaming the country Zaire. As a dictator, he wielded absolute control, fostering a cult of personality and enriching himself through what became known as a kleptocracy. He looted the country's wealth, amassing billions while the population endured widespread poverty and economic collapse. Though he still maintained strong international support from the US, France, and Belgium, only for his anti-communist stance, and his regime was marked by rampant corruption and human rights abuses. By the 1990s, economic decline and internal dissent weakened his grip on power, and in 1997, he was ousted by rebel forces led by Laurent Désiré Kabila, fleeing into exile in Morocco, where he died of cancer later that year. All right, next up we're going to talk about Francisco Franco, and he was a Spanish military general who became the dictator of Spain from 1939 until his death in 1975. Born into a military family in Ferrol, Galicia, Franco rose quickly through the ranks of the Spanish army, earning recognition for his leadership in Morocco during the Rif War. As a conservative and monarchist, he opposed the establishment of the Second Spanish Republic in 1931 and was reluctantly drawn into the 1936 military coup that sparked the Spanish Civil War. Franco emerged as the leader of the nationalist forces, consolidating power after the deaths of other rebel leaders and officially declaring victory in 1939. He established a one-party state under his personalist rule, known as Francoist Spain, characterized by political repression, centralized authority, and an emphasis on Spanish nationalism and Catholicism. He maintained a precarious balance between authoritarian control and economic modernization. His regime executed tens of thousands of political opponents in a campaign of repression known as the White Terror. During World War II, Franco maintained Spain's neutrality while providing limited support to the Axis powers. And following the war, he aligned Spain with Western powers during the Cold War, leading to economic growth in the 1960s and a period known as the Spanish Miracle. Franco declared Spain a monarchy, but left the throne vacant until naming Juan Carlos as his successor, and his death in 1975 would mark the end of his autocratic regime and paved the way for Spain's transition to democracy. All right, next up, we're going to talk about Robert Mugabe, and he was a Zimbabwean revolutionary leader and politician who played a key role in the country's liberation from British colonial rule and its subsequent development into independent rule. Born to a Shona family, he was an educator and Marxist thinker who joined the nationalist movement to fight against the white minority rule in southern Rhodesia. After serving time in prison for political activism, he led the Zimbabwe African National Union and its military wing in a guerrilla war against the Rhodesian government during the 1970s. Following the Lancaster House Agreement, Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, and Mugabe became its first prime minister, later serving as president in 1987. His early years in office were marked by efforts to expand education and healthcare, but these were overshadowed by repressive policies and a campaign of violence known as the Gukurahundi, which targeted opposition groups, resulting in thousands of deaths. As leader, he became increasingly autocratic, particularly after the 1990s when his regime faced growing internal dissent and economic decline. He implemented controversial land redistribution policies, forcibly seizing white-owned farms to address historical injustices, but these actions led to economic collapse, hyperinflation, and widespread poverty. He only maintained power through electoral manipulation, violence, and a strong reliance on the military. And although he was hailed by some as a symbol of African liberation, his later years were characterized by accusations of corruption, human rights abuses, and economic mismanagement. And in 2017, after decades in power, he was ousted in a coup and replaced by his former deputy, Emerson Mnangagwa, and he would eventually die in 2019. All right, next up, we're going to talk about Rafael Trujillo, and he was a Dominican military officer and dictator who ruled the Dominican Republic from 1930 until his death in 1961. Born in 1891 in San Cristobal, he rose from humble beginnings, working various jobs before joining the U.S.-created National Guard in 1918 during the American occupation of the Dominican Republic. His aptitude for leadership and ruthless ambition led to rapid military promotions, and he eventually became the head of the Dominican Army. Trujillo would eventually seize power in a 1930 coup, securing presidency through fraudulent elections and cementing his authority as a military strongman. His rule, known as the Trujillo era, was marked by a cult of personality, widespread oppression, and the use of state terrorism to suppress dissent. His regime combined economic modernization with brutal repression. As well, he stabilized the nation and achieved significant infrastructure development. His rule was marked by corruption and human rights abuses, including the 1937 Parsley Massacre, where tens of thousands of Haitians were killed. Trujillo maintained control through a powerful secret police, political purges, and censorship. Internationally, his actions strained relationships, particularly with neighboring countries and the United States. By the late 1950s, opposition to his rule would intensify, both domestically and abroad, culminating in his assassination in 1961. All right, next up, we're going to talk about François Duvalier, and commonly known as Papa Doc. He was a Haitian politician and voodooist who ruled Haiti as president from 1957 until his death in 1971. Born in Port-au-Prince in 1907, he trained as a physician and gained recognition for his work combating tropical diseases, which earned him the nickname Papa Doc. He was deeply influenced by Black nationalist ideas and Haiti's voodoo traditions, which he later used to consolidate power. After serving in public health and ministerial roles under the administration of President Dumarasai Estime, Francois entered politics and won the 1957 presidential election on a populist and Black nationalist platform. His campaign capitalized on the frustrations of the Afro-Haitian majority against the dominant mulatto elite, positioning him as a champion of the marginalized. However, Francois consolidated his power through fear, repression, and a personality cult. He created the notorious Tonton Makute militia, which brutally eliminated political opponents and suppressed dissent, fostering a climate of pervasive fear. He merged his political authority with spiritual influence of voodoo, portraying himself as a mystical figure aligned with the spirit world, and in 1964, he declared himself president for life. Under his regime, thousands were killed or exiled, and the nation's infrastructure and economy deteriorated due to his corruption and mismanagement. And while he enjoyed some support among rural Black Haitians, his reign left Haiti impoverished and destabilized, and he remained in power until his death in 1971 and would be succeeded by his son, Jean-Claude Duvalier. All right, next up we're going to talk about Ne Win, and he was a Burmese military leader and politician who served as the prime minister and later the president of Burma, now Myanmar, and he rose to prominence during Burma's fight for independence as one of the 30 Comrades, which was a group trained by the Japanese to lead the Burma Independence Army during World War II. Now, after gaining independence in 1948, Ne Win played a significant role in shaping the Burmese military, becoming the chief of staff of the armed forces and taking on an influential role in suppressing internal uprisings. In 1958, he briefly became the interim prime minister to stabilize a fractured government and return power to civilian rule in 1960. However, in 1962, he would decide to seize power through a coup d'etat, establishing a one-party socialist state under his control. His rule was characterized by authoritarianism, economic isolation, and a rigid adherence to the, quote, Burmese way to socialism. His government nationalized industries, expelled foreigners, and promoted ethnic and cultural assimilation policies, which led to massive targeting of minorities. His economic policies, including erratic currency reforms influenced by superstition, caused widespread poverty and economic stagnation, and his regime would rely on heavy-handed repression to suppress dissent, which was exemplified by the violent suppression of protests, the destruction of Rangoon's University Student Union. He would eventually resign amidst the 8088 uprising, or the People Power uprising, that overthrew the Burma Socialist Program Party and was replaced by the military junta of the State Law and Order Restoration Council, who would actually hold minor influence in the 1990s, but was eventually placed under house arrest, and he would die in 2002. All right, that's pretty much everyone we're going to talk about except for pre-modern, because that video would be like 1 million hours. I know for a fact there's going to be people that are going to be commenting like, where's Putin? Where's Netanyahu? And let's get like just a couple things straight before we end this. So traditionally, a dictator would be defined as a leader who has absolute power. Now, that's absolute power and authority over a country wielded through authoritarian or tyrannical means. Now, there's several key factors that makes a dictator: centralized power, of course, the lack of political pluralism, it's usually one party, the use of force and the control of the state, and a personality cult. And the only thing that makes someone like Netanyahu or Putin not technically a dictator, is that they operate within functioning democratic societies despite their controversial actions or decisions. So yes, they do shitty things. They're fucking terrible, but they technically operate within a democratic system. Like, for example, while Putin is, of course, accused of authoritarianism, especially in terms of suppressing opposition and consolidating power, and of course, invading Ukraine, he works within a system where legal and political institutions, despite being super weak, still exist. Netanyahu, of course, criticized for his policies, especially in regarding the treatment of Palestinians and the political climate in Israel. Under his rule, Israel is doing extremely shitty things to innocent people. However, Israel is a functioning democracy with a free press, opposition parties, and regular elections. The same shit would go with someone like Andrew Jackson. Terrible fucking person. And although he was the 7th president of the United States, he literally exhibited autocratic tendencies, disregarding the rulings of the Supreme Court, i.e. in the case of the Trail of Tears, and consolidating power. Jackson operated within the bounds of the U.S. Constitution, and he only served the terms he was elected for. I mean, I hope you guys understand. Look, if we want to that badly, we could just make a video on war crimes. But yeah, I don't know. Ronald Reagan was a devil too. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I tried to do this as best as I could. Always leave comments about more information or other people that you felt that I should have covered. But yeah, I hope you guys are doing well. Again, I hope you enjoyed the video. And I'll catch you in the next one. I love you, bro.